We want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Google, Grassroots Analytics, Ripple, which is ROI, Running Mate, and Winnable. They're the folks who help make these events possible and give us the ability to have some flexible programming over the course of the summer. And we also have some really amazing partners. They're all listed here. These are folks who are from across the progressive ecosystem, who they themselves are also doing events and community actions and things like that that you might want to get connected to. And so throughout the summer, we will be partnering with some of these folks to host some of our events. We also might be highlighting events that they are putting on their own. And so this is a great way to, sort of get an introduction. And so we'll drop a poll, we'll open up a poll so that folks can get connected, and we will share your information with these amazing folks. And so groups like Swing Left, Progressive Pipeline Project, if you're interested in running for office yourself, we can connect you up with Run for Something. If you are someone who wants to understand more about direct action and how you can incorporate some of your skills as an artist, we can connect you with a group like C4AA. There's a whole host of ways that you can get involved, and we want to be able to facilitate those connections for you. And so that is part of it. All right, the poll is going. This slide here was just a reminder for myself, and I did it. Congratulations, me. But you all are here for Innovations to Take Back Congress. And so this is a panel where we have an amazing lineup of panelists. We're gonna explore tactics, things that were tried out and piloted in the 2024 cycle, or things that might be on tap to be implemented in this upcoming cycle. So what lessons could we learn? What's going to be pivotal for us in important congressional races? We want to help you build up some understanding of like, where are the places where we might be trying to employ these tactics, and as with any arena event, hopefully give you a little bit of dash of hope leaving here today, because there's a lot happening. And it's always good to get introduced to some amazing folks who are doing amazing work. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to open it up so that we can get our amazing panelists here up on the arena stage with me. And so I want to introduce to you all Zoe Stein from Movement Labs and Contest Every Race, David Cyril from the Analyst Institute, Dalia Rodriguez from Jayapal's Resistance Lab, and Shripal Shah from the House Majority PAC. And so this amazing crew is going to take us, give us their insights, share a little bit about what they've done and the amazing work that they are doing going forward. And we're just really grateful for their expertise and for them to be on the stage with us. And so we're going to go around. Everyone's going to sort of introduce themselves, say a little bit more about their organizations and what they did last cycle. And to kick us off, Zoe, we'll do like, just for this first one, because I'm going to lose track, but like the reverse alphabetical. So we're going to go with Zoe first.
Okay, hello everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the chat. My name is Zoe. I'm the executive director for Contest Every Race, which is a project of Movement Labs. We focus on defeating the MAGA agenda and supporting rural organizing year-round in really like almost all 50 states. It's really quite a massive effort now. But in 2024, we recruited thousands of Democrats to also run for local office in previously uncontested races. There's 100,000 elections in the United States in 2025 alone, and half will go uncontested by Democrats. So we try to fix that and also work with our county parties and teams to have them supporting this effort. But yeah, this year we had over 1,200 teams apply to be part of the grants program, which is really awesome. And I'm excited to share more about the program and taking back Congress.
Fantastic. I'll kick it down to David.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Searle, he, him. I'm the Deputy Director of Research Projects at Analyst Institute. We're the kind of premier research institution for progressive organizations. Since we've been founded over 15 years ago, we've conducted hundreds of randomized experiments, but we also conduct other types of research as well in order to kind of pull out best practices and our recommendations and as well as our trainings to kind of pull out best practices on how to kind of run effective campaigns and programs. And excited to talk a little bit more about that.
Awesome. Dahlia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dalia Rodriguez. I'm the Outreach and Organizing Director for Congresswoman Jayapal's re-election campaign support Mela for Congress. Last cycle, we focused on working in swing states. The Congresswoman was going out and mobilizing folks from door knocking to phone banking. And it's so mobilizing in other states as well as mobilizing inside our district, which includes Seattle. And then this year we're doing the Resistance Lab, which we're training folks on organizing, which is part of our year-round organizing with our team.
Fantastic. Shripal.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to see everybody. I'm Shripal Shah. I am with House Majority PAC. House Majority PAC and House Majority Forward are organized as a super PAC, and C4, we're the main third-party entity for the House Democratic Caucus. So we spend our resources almost entirely on persuasion, though we did invest heavily last year as well in mobilization and voter registration and turnout. In my role last year as the IE director, I oversaw roughly $250 million in spending in the persuasion space, majority of which is advertising, whether it's on YouTube or broadcast television, but also direct mail, district-specific and national polling and testing, and basically everything under the sun across roughly 40 districts. And this is now my second cycle at House Majority PAC, so looking forward to finishing the job that we came so close to doing last year. I think we lost the majority by about 7,000 votes spread out across a handful of districts. But excited to be here today. Thanks for having us.
Amazing. So now you know what I know. We got a stacked panel, everything from organizing to persuasion, media, and testing. So a lot to share here from this group. And so, a lot of folks, here on this panel, but also in the audience, come from a wide range of backgrounds. Can you all tell us, and I think everyone's going to jump in on this one, tell us a little bit more about, how the campaign tactics have changed over the past years, 10 years, maybe 10, maybe even shorter time range. And how has, innovation and testing led to those changes? And so, Zoe, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Yeah, sure. So prior to being with Movement Labs at Contest Every Race, I'm one of the co-founders of an organization called Relentless. There's a tool called Rally for relational organizing, and we focused a lot on trying to figure out how to measure what would otherwise be tough to measure programs. In campaign world, what I have found, and I wonder if others disagree, is that the gravitational pull to the status quo is really, really strong, because especially a candidate campaign, all that really matters at the end of the day is, did you win or not? So we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater when there's like a really innovative, cool thing, but you lost. I think that I have seen an increase in attention being given to RCTs in our space. I think Analyst Institute is a huge reason for that. And I think that we have a handful of donors in the ecosystem that really care about evidence-based programs and like to see that in terms of how it relates to cost. And that's been, I think, helping move us towards making sure we're investing in programs that do work. But the tricky thing, especially with organizing too, is that not all programs fit neatly into a petri dish where you can measure them in a lab. And I mean, there's some other things I think that are happening in the space that are pushing people towards more evidence-based programming, which is cool. At Movement Labs, we have a Prove It prize, where if your program, if you do an RCT, or we can set up some type of experiment, Analysts Institute, we work with y'all all the time, then donors will give you money, will pay out for the program being successful. So I think innovative stuff like that is helping us see the space move too. But yeah, I'm curious what others on the stage think.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that, sort of thinking about what are the different ways that you can prove it. Is that an RCT? And how do you also leave room open for things that are harder to track? I think is an interesting sort of thing that is bubbling up right now as we sort of evaluate what worked last cycle. But David, interested from the Analyst Institute perspective, like what does that look like in the testing space? How's that evolved?
I mean, the fact that there is a testing space is a huge change over the last decade. Today there's so many more organizations that have research staff, as well as just organizations that are conducting research, which is fantastic because our gut is often wrong, and that's why we do research. And so I think we've come a very long way. We've certainly played a critical role in the socialization and kind of culturalization process of experimentation. We certainly agree with what both of you have already said, that there's a right and a wrong place for an RCT and an experiment, and I think it provides a lot of valuable evidence that we've been able to build on in terms of providing valuable evidence in terms of what works and what doesn't, and that there's kind of other methods that we can go to better understand the why something might work and why something might not, or just other problems that are not fit for that particular research method. But I think in particular, we've been able to test things over and over and over again over the last 15 years in order to pull out those best practices and identify what works. And so, things like sticking to nonpartisan topics when you're talking about GOTV, things like that. And so, civic duty sounds great, but is it really the best thing that we can do to try and get people to vote? What other things can we do? And so testing has really been important. It also has just allowed us to ask more interesting questions than just does something work, but it's like, does static versus video ads, what's most effective? What's most effective for voter turnout versus persuasion? And so we've been able to explore different types of questions in order to kind of draw out innovation and kind of best practices.
Santiago, can I add something really fast?
Go for it.
So I think that for folks on this call, an important thing to know is there are an increasing number of donors that like knowing our shit works. And when we're able to figure out, even if it takes like really creative ways of trying to run your program a different way, ways to measure that, that does us a huge service for getting more funds to do the work that we all care so deeply about doing. So for Contest Every Race, we measure an organizing program. It's the longest standing measured organizing program, I think, in the space. Feel free to correct me if someone else has a longer one. But we originally had to figure out how to do this with a synthetic control, where we, instead of randomizing the teams in the program, we found lookalike counties and compare the results to that. So is it as rigorous as if we had a true control? No. Did it actually help open the door to other funding for us and show that like, actually, this looks like a really promising program at a low cost to invest in organizing year round? Yes. And now with more money, we're able to run a bigger program and we're able to have a true control. And I believe it will show, yes, investing early in organizing is a beneficial thing to move votes for Democrats. But that was only possible through this incremental and creative way of measuring. And that's the importance of measuring your work.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And I run into that trap too, where I'm like, oh, I couldn't possibly do an RCT, a random control trial here. So we won't, and like the data tracking to sort of provide a proof point and sort of incrementally get yourself, I think is a really smart sort of way to like continue along the path of like sort of continuing to prove like this works and like build up a sort of body of evidence. So I think that's really interesting. Dahlia or Shripal, any thoughts that you want to add on this question?
I'm happy to go first. I think the broader question that we started off with about like how tactics have changed over the past decade or so is a really interesting one. I think for me, when you live primarily in the persuasion space like I have lived my entire career, your tactical execution of your program budget, it really needs to be aligned with, your audience's consumption habits. And I think that shift has become very real in the House space, more so last cycle than it ever has been before, because, 2, 3, 4 cycles ago, there was still this belief across the operative world that broadcast was the most important thing. It's not anymore. I mean, it's grossly inefficient, but also like not a lot of people, as far as voters as a whole are concerned, are watching TV in the same way that they have been. And I feel like there are at times a little bit of a disconnect between one class of people who are doing the work and another class of people who are doing the work, that really needs to be bridged. And for us at House Majority PAC last year, our budgets on streaming, on YouTube, on CTV, on all those things grew exponentially. And I know there's going to be more opportunities to talk about some of this stuff in specifics, but I really think that how we invested in our programming was a massive tactical shift, and that led to really serious overperformance in a lot of key places. I'm not convinced that if we would have run the organization like we did in 2020 or 2018, with the overwhelming volume of budget going to broadcast, that we would have had the same results, because the world is just different now, and people don't necessarily consume information in the same way that they did 2, 4, 6 years ago. And I think we need to be really intentional about how we build and execute our programs as a result.
Yeah. And you're at a group, House Majority PAC has a big budget, and you're in a position, and I'm glad you're in a position to be able to make those decisions about how you shift your spend from broadcast TV to streaming. Like, are there any thoughts for how other folks can sort of move the needle in places where they're going to maybe come up against people who have the conventional wisdom of broadcast is king sort of thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think, obviously a lot of this depends on budget, but let me give one really concrete example, which, was a very specific test we did last year in August, leading up to, the bulk of the IE spend. So, I don't know if there's folks from the Central Valley in California on this Zoom, but California 13 is a district that Adam Gray won by a very, 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 very small margin last year. The Central Valley is very different than Southern California or Northern California, Bay Area or Orange County or whatever. Very rural, very Latino electorate, et cetera. But it's split into 2 media markets. Fresno is about 2/3 of the district, and Sacramento is 1/3 of the district. And what we wanted to do back in August was really test broadcast versus just YouTube. And so what we did was, in partnership with the team at YouTube, was, prior to us spending on broadcast and YouTube over the course of 2 weeks, we ran a poll across the entire district, and then we ran just broadcast in Fresno with a price tag of about $400K, and just YouTube in the Sacramento portion of the district, which was a dollar amount of $120K. And then we polled again, and we asked, recall questions, message salience, all the things. And the recall in the Fresno broadcast market, which again was a 4x dollar amount cost, was +4. And in the YouTube market, which again, fraction of the spend, was +21. I've never seen anything like that in my entire career. But for me, that was incredibly eye-opening. And for our entire organization, all of our vendors and everything, was wow, we really have something here. And yes, Gina, holy cannoli, exactly right. I've never seen anything like that. But for us, it was okay, everything we've heard and seen and read, whether it's from Nielsen or Google reporting data about consumption habits and how much time people spend on this platform, has now been demonstrated to be true by this test. The test works so well that the Republican, Duarte, the ads we were running were attacking him on his opposition to abortion rights. The test worked so well that we actually helped the Republican increase his vote share, because this guy never talked about abortion prior. So we were telling the electorate that he was one of them and helped them consolidate Republicans. That happens over the course of a 100-day program anyways, regardless of whether you're spending here or there. We did it in 2 weeks. And that was just so eye-opening to me. And as a result, once we got into September and October, we were blowing YouTube out of the water at HMP. In some districts, we were spending $200K a week just on YouTube. And lo and behold, in all those places where we did that, we overperformed and ended up winning 215 congressional districts, where Harris only won in 205 congressional districts. And I think that was really, really intuitive for us.
Incredible. Dahlia, anything before we close out this question that you want to chime in with?
Well, I just wanna agree with my fellow panelists. A lot of things have changed, and when it comes about being on the ground, so or just organizing, we're meeting folks at different places now. I feel like there's a lot of use when it comes to like digital, especially just mobilizing young voters for us. And for campaigns, I know for at least the campaigns that I work on, we do keep up to date with what my fellow panelists are doing, which are like doing the tests and everything to see how we could implement it to our district.
Yeah, I think like,
Mhm.
especially as you're sort of like out in the field executing your campaigns, keeping an eye on things like, you know, the Facebook media library, or just sort of just being a savvy consumer of, you know, what your sort of peer campaigns are doing can also be a helpful insight into like, what are other people testing and trying out as they go. And so, you know, thank you all for, that was just our first question. And we like, I'm gonna have to have somebody keep help me keep time here so that we can get to all these amazing questions. But some people alluded to it a little bit. Tree Paul, you alluded to this, like congressional races played out a little bit differently than you know, the top of the ticket presidential. You know, and so are there things that, you know, tactics, strategies that, you know, are going to look different than what they might look like on a presidential race, or is there, you know, a lot of overlap between the two? Yeah, folks, if who wants to dive in first? Shripal, I saw you nod your head.
Yeah, I'm happy to start there. I think so. The House map was weird last year in that like a chunk of our map overlapped with the Senate and presidential battleground states, and then a giant chunk of our map just didn't, right? Like California, New York, etc., states that were just not ever going to be contested. You know, House races are inherently smaller than the presidential, and they are not litigated in the earned media in the way that the Trump-Harris race was. And that's a real challenge, but also presents a whole lot of opportunity. I think, you know, part of this is just national environment. It's going to be driven by the presidential, et cetera, and that's the ball game that we play. But because people don't inherently know their member of Congress or the candidates that they know in the same way that they are getting information about, like when it comes to the presidential or even the Senate or Gov's races, I actually think there's an opportunity to sort of build more of a narrative around what your candidate is trying to talk about and the argument against your opposition in a way that I think in part we really leveraged well last year. And that was almost entirely focused on an economic uh uh message sort of priority. Like we all know that cost and inflation were like going to be number one, and that's in part what played out and why Trump unfortunately had the success that he had. I think for us at HMP, we were able to recognize that early and realize that like just because something is the most, salient top testing message in a battery in a poll doesn't mean that that's your ticket to victory. You're going to have a much more seriously comprehensive conversation with electorate. And that meant for us, in some instances, running like 3 to 4 message tracks in a given district. That was one focused on Republicans being extreme on abortion rights or whatever issue was a focus in a district, but two, making an economic positive case for the Democrat, and then also making an economic negative case against the Republican. And we were able to do that. And I think we benefited from the fact that people just don't know their members of Congress or their candidates as well as they do know or are getting information about at the top of the ticket. And in my mind, that was one of the bigger things that led to the overperformance and along with the tactical shift of how we were allocating resources and programming may have played a really big part in us overperforming last cycle.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting because, like, you know, oftentimes there's like a false choice that folks sort of talk about, and it's really easy to talk about like, you know, an economic message versus, you know, what are these key issues, and being able to do both is super important, and you got to be able to do both. And I feel like that's something that people in the throwing the baby out with the bathwater on everything. You're like, okay, well, that didn't work, so we can't talk. This is the only thing we can talk about.
For
I think
sure.
that's
Yeah.
and you
And
mentioned,
look, just to be clear, just to be clear about this, like I really appreciate that we had $250 million to play with, right? Like that's a different, beast
yeah,
that we're talking about. And not everyone is going to have multi-million-dollar budgets per district, but it was a luxury that we were afforded, and one that we leveraged appropriately. And again, I think that it's a lot harder when you're having to make very difficult decisions about resource allocation.
no, I think that's a really smart sort of point to draw out. And we talk a lot about that in the training context of like, okay, what's your capacity? Do you have the ability to talk about more than one thing? Like that's where those hard decisions come in. And so I think that's a really good point. And Shripal mentioned a little bit about, okay, here are places that were completely off the map for the presidential, where a lot of people didn't understand or fully know who their congressional representatives are. David, can you talk a little bit about sort of how easy it is or difficult it is to test in a presidential type environment and how that looks differently going into, this is an off year. We have Virginia races going on right now, and how that will even look again different in the midterm years. What's the testing environment look like, and like what kind of impacts can you see?
Yeah, it's very challenging to test in presidential years. We have uh, we're wrapping up our results from last year. We have several sets of null results where we don't find an effect, and that can be for a number of different reasons. Maybe something didn't work, but maybe it's just such a noisy environment that it's hard to kind of isolate the impact of a single organization when there's so many organizations. There was like $16 billion spent last cycle. Like it's just hard to isolate one group's impact. And so we are big believers in testing in odd years like this year, whether that's Virginia, New Jersey, the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, Georgia has statewide races, mayoral elections across the country. I think Omaha just had their mayoral and city council races, right? Like these are important local races, and in quieter, kind of less crazy environments, it can be a little bit easier to test tactics, which allow us to kind of figure out what works and what doesn't. Now, what you find in 2025, and it's not going to have the same impact next year, but it can provide us evidence in terms of what works and what doesn't. And I think that's really what we're looking for when we're trying to compare the value of different strategies or different messages in trying to figure out kind of, yeah, it's not going to have quite the same impact in the midterm year than it will this year, but at least can we figure out kind of how can we do something well and how can it work really well? And so that's something that we're working on this year as well for a number of kind of high priority projects. It's also uh, a great opportunity when people know less about kind of what's going on. And so I think that's where mobilization becomes much more important. I think in a presidential year, top of the ticket is doing a lot of the mobilization. And so the further you go down ballot, you can really focus your programs on persuasion. Whereas this year, it's a little bit different. You kind of have to be able to mix the two for the different audiences and try to figure out kind of what works and what doesn't. And so I think one of the big things that we like to talk about beyond testing in audiors, which we certainly do, is like raising the point that don't assume that you'll do, X tactic or Y tactic, and really investigate, do your homework, and take a fresh look at what you should be doing. I think there's things that we know work, like texting. Texting mobilizes. Zoe, I'm sure you could talk a lot about that. At the same time, like you need to also, do other tactics as well in order to get to your win number. And so figuring out kind of what that array looks like is going to be really important.
David, can I jump in? Actually, Santiago, I can give two examples of things that didn't work. I would say one of my favorite things about Movement Labs is that we are very comfortable with failure and sharing with the space things that are not successes. That is super not a norm because and it's very easy for it to seem like or for it to be read as this didn't work. The person running the program is bad at their job. And in a space like ours, where you have a lot of job insecurity and we have a lot of turnover because the cycle ends, you have to find another job. Like that fucking sucks. So for someone to know your program bombed and then be like, oh yeah, do you want to hire me to be your organizing director, even though my program was shitty? Like tough. It's a tough sell. But I do think that the more we can get better at understanding how, like, why we measure and doing so, to David's point, like we do need to test things and know if they work. So here's two examples from the past cycle. I ran our political innovation team. We had an incubator. We tried dozens and dozens and dozens of ideas, actually hundreds of ideas, but we scaled a dozen. We did a pilot and we Saul Kuno, who used to be the head of research at Analyst Institute, really like found this very fascinating that somewhere in LA there was a newspaper, like they subscribe people to a newspaper and they thought it would help turnout. Like what if people who don't get the news get the news? They're like, oh my God, I must vote for the mayor, whatever election it was. And they saw a decrease in turnout from the people that they subscribed to newspapers. So we were like, that's weird. We should like, what if we sent people like like a fluff piece that was like we made it was like the Maricopa Examiner, like we made up a paper and we wrote like all the cool shit the Biden administration has done in like really simple terms with like human interest pieces. I actually thought it was a lovely paper. We had local events, we had a cherry pie recipe. Anyway, it was a single mail piece that we did, and it it moved people against Biden Harris by a point. This was not in the general election. This was ahead, and we were doing, we were measuring ahead of time. Don't worry, but a fucking point for, excuse my language, but like David can kind of speak to this. You don't see a single mailer move someone a point. That's crazy. It was one of the most effective things we would have done if it had gone the other way. So anyway, if we just went with our gut and it was like Zoe's World and it was like, this is a great mailer, we should send this to everyone, like that would have been a nightmare. Another thing that we tried that's more embarrassing, but maybe some people heard of this in a Slack somewhere, but it was an AI generated hot girl, and we sent it to Republican boys, and it was like, I only date boys who vote for Harris. Performed like 400 times worse than the control. Like just wild. So anyway, this is why we test things. It's hard to be honest about the things that don't work, but off years are the time, guys. Like this is the time.
Thank you for sharing those. And yes, I did see the AI thing make the rounds on Slack. But I think that is important. And it's not only the sort of negative results, but also the null results I think are important in terms of being able to sort of try things, give yourselves the space to try things, and also understand the context in which, like, okay, there's a lot happening. Maybe we won't see the effects that we need to, but it is good to have sort of these mechanisms to sort of hold ourselves accountable. So I think that's great. And I haven't seen anybody in the chat ask for the cherry pie recipe yet, but I'm sure it'll come.
I'll send around the newspaper. It was a great paper.
I'm super interested. So maybe it'll go in the arena Slack after this. So, there were a lot of losses and wins last cycle. Can you all share, an innovation that your organization is spearheading that you're like excited to like continue either testing or build upon in the next heading into the midterms? Dahlia, is there anything you want to kick us off with on this question?
So our team, we have the Resistance Lab as part of our year-round organizing. So we're really kind of working on mobilizing folks because there's a lot going on right now and people want to get involved. So the Congresswoman, she's doing trainings on organizing how to be safe during protests. She talks about the history, and that really kind of encourages people and shows them how they could mobilize in enough year and how they could create different groups and different strategies in their own communities. across the nation where they could come together and support each other as well as just create change. So we've had different people do different things. So I know like there's a group in Montana that came about who's doing who are protesting in front of their city council because they want more, they want to be able to like protest because there's a lot of, they're putting a lot of different things for them to not be able to because it's a very red area. And then we've also had more folks just being able to like pass around different things and do trainings themselves with their organization. So we're working very closely with Indivisible, Swing Labs, and other partners. So that's been really cool for our team. And we're just excited to continue building organizers and folks who haven't really organized before to start organizing in their communities and just having the congresswomen go out there too and help them and and having our team work with them directly.
I love it. You know, and I think you all have like a unique position because you're like, you know, organizing and helping activate people in areas. And we've talked a little bit about, you know, how even the congressional map this past year didn't have a ton of overlap with, you know, traditional battlegrounds. And there are a lot of people in red states who, you know, like the folks in Montana, like trying to figure out how they can get involved, find community, but also, you know, push back in very hyper local ways. And so I think giving them the tools is, you know, all a part of those elements of what is long-term organizing. And I think a lot of people are asking that question of like, what does long-term organizing look like in this moment? And you all are sort of stepping up and filling that and like giving people an answer to that. So I love that. Other folks, what are things that you all are excited and spearheading going into the midterms? Shripal?
Yeah, I think for us, again, because we live in the persuasion space and so much of our budget goes to advertising, we were really intentional about last year, recognizing that it's presidential year, everyone's being bombarded with ads, even if you are not necessarily living in, you know, Michigan or Arizona or whatever it was. But for me, you know, in the House, standing out is a big part of the ball game because we're not a presidential, we're not the Senate, we're not the governors, whatever it was. And I took this job with a very intentional perspective on we need our content and our ads to not just feel authentic, but look organic, for people to actually sort of consume what we were trying to push on them. Because we're not Marriott or Bonvoy or whatever the brand is. Like we're not selling vacations and beaches and hotels and stuff. Like we're trying to get people to take their medicine, and that's just inherently hard. And I think the creative execution really matters for that. You know, long before I even took the job, it stood out to me when I was watching the Super Bowl, I think in 2023. And during the third quarter, there was a Pfizer ad that was shot like a TikTok, like with the black bars on the screen. And, you know, Pfizer paid $8 million for 30 seconds of inventory on that. So, like, I got to think that they did some testing or something to know that their creative strategy and execution, you know, was going to be worth the $8 million. And, like, that really stood out to me because it was a TikTok vertical shot ad, style ad on TV. And we did a lot of that in partnership by sourcing a whole bunch of content creators to just get stuff that looked more organic. And I want to scale that because I do think that like, you know, people inherently tune out the scary narrator political ad because they just don't care for it. And if you're in a media market like Phoenix or Vegas or Detroit or whatever, that's already so saturated, you really have to be able to find a way to stick out. And I think taking that kind of content to more broadcast, more TV viewing experiences is something that, you know, we're really being intentional about and we want to do more of because you're seeing it with these brands, and maybe it's time for us to sort of adapt accordingly on our creative strategy, and that's something I'm really excited about.
Yeah, and I think like, you know, I mentioned this earlier, being a savvy consumer of what your peers are doing, you know, and what other organizations that are maybe higher resourced, like I've heard this advice from other folks as well, like looking to, all right, this is what the big firms are, companies are doing. They have a lot of research and testing that goes into their work. So I think that's a good thing to sort of build on and sort of look to and gather inspiration. And I like that you're like trying to be intentional about, okay, I'm in this role, what can I do with it? And I think that's something for us all to take away and be like, okay, in this next cycle, in my job, what are the things that I want to do that push it? And I think there's a lot of inspiration to draw from the folks on this panel for that, so that you all sort of go out into however you're involved in the next cycle, building upon, and trying to push what we're doing. We talked a little bit about sort of things that didn't work, that definitely didn't work. Zoe was brave and in sharing that. Are there others who want to jump in on that point? Is there anything else that we should know that, like, hey, maybe this needs more investigation before we fully dive in? Or if there's anything else you want to expand on, Zoe, but just wanted to open up the floor to folks here.
I'm happy to try. I want to be mindful of the fact that, like, when you win, you're brilliant, and when you lose, you're stupid, and it's always actually not that black and white. You know what I mean? Like, um, I think, but I do think that, like, we as a party need to be really honest with ourselves about how we communicate with the electorate, what methods and vehicles we lean on. I think one of the things that we learned last cycle in congressional races specifically, is that the earned media is not what it used to be when it comes to dropping Oppo and hoping to land some sort of knockout punch. Like, I just don't think that's real life. There was some really big stories that came out, particularly in the Times last year, about some members of Congress from New York and some really unethical things they were doing. And, we beat a bunch of these Republicans, and that's all great. But this idea that if everyone's honest with themselves about how, one, consumption habits have changed, two, people don't trust the mainstream media because they don't have the credibility that they used to have, um, and all of that, then you kind of need to be a little more thoughtful and comprehensive about how you release Oppo. And I think there's a lot of space to be creative there. I think there's a lot of space to potentially take stuff direct to consumer in partnership with content creators, and then allocating budget to make sure you get the reach and frequency you want. But I think we are in a new place where we need to really be honest with ourselves about sort of how we disseminate the Oppo that we get. I don't think I think Oppo is still inherently valuable. Finding bad information about the person you're running against is a huge net positive. But I do think that, like, in the House specifically, there might be some space to be creative about the execution and the dissemination.
I think
Yeah.
along the lines of us being honest with each other, like I think that we've had, I'll just give you two examples of things that I wouldn't say didn't work. I think that's not the right thing, but things that we need to re-examine. And I think on the one hand, we've had some very interesting results on door-to-door canvassing, which is a foundational tactic. And so we need to really kind of dive in and dig deep and kind of figure out what's going on there. And on the other hand, kind of on the persuasion world, is online ad testing, which has become ubiquitous. You can't test in the field, you can't do field RCTs for persuasion. I mean, you can do it. It's just really expensive. And doing it in cycle is even more expensive. And so online ad testing is fast, it's affordable, and everyone's doing it. And how well are people interpreting those results to make sure that, is there really a difference between the top two or three messages? Probably not. It's much, the top and the bottom, sure, but, making sure that folks have an understanding and training on how to interpret those effects. And also, I think that we just need more foundational evidence to demonstrate that what we are finding in those top 2 or 3 messages is actually translating into the real world. We're making this big assumption because that's, to be frank, what we can afford to do. But I think that we also need to kind of invest in the R&D, like other industries, and make sure that what we think is true is true.
Big plus to that. We did a lot of message testing. My newspaper was message tested. But Sanjay, back over to you.
No. I think that's like there is a difference, right, between like the varying levels of ways that you could test, right? And like you could do a message test, you can do something a little bit more, if you have the resources and the time to do an RCT. They're different. They can still give you an informed approach on how to proceed and like allocate some amount of resources. And so both have their place. It's like just the balancing act of like, okay, well, how do you move forward with this and like how do you interpret those results? And I think there's a lot of room to grow for everyone on how we interpret those results and be good consumers of those types of message testing. We have less than 10 minutes, I believe. So we have a handful of questions. I think we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions. I believe folks have the ability to vote on questions. So take a look at the Q&A, but I'll keep us moving. David, you started to touch on this, I think, a little bit, or at least this is where my mind went in terms of connecting the dots. This cycle, we saw some interesting results maybe on efficacy of door-to-door canvassing. We touched on like, testing ads in cycle. Like, what are some of the limitations of these studies? And like, if we saw some really sort of contradictory results on a tactic like canvassing, whereas like the body of research leading up to it, was saying this is an effective thing to do. How much do we read into that? What are some of the limitations with that? How do we also not ignore, like, to I think a point that Shripal was, sort of giving in another context, like earned media, like some of this, not only the effects, but like the reach of these tactics is waning. So it's like those 2 things are sort of happening at the same time, but are different. How do we think about these limitations?
I mean, we kind of have to look at each individual study and understanding its kind of strengths and weaknesses. As we've kind of touched on, experiments are great for identifying kind of what works and what doesn't. But there are other methods to better understand kind of why something is working and kind of what else people are thinking. We did some surveys after the election that are, observational. And, people are saying that they've received tons of information. But if you dive in, and they'll say that they had enough information, but then it's a matter of, well, did you have the information you need? Well, what we're really doing is just like overwhelming everyone with like a reminder to vote. But what about the other types of content that we could be sending them in terms of whether it's persuasion or kind of more specific information around mobilization? And so there's other kind of methods that we kind of take into kind of better understand the interplay of kind of what's going on. The other thing I would say is that, you know, we build our recommendations based off of repeated experiments across contexts and geographies and types of voters to try to kind of create evergreen recommendations regardless as to where you're at. At the same time, when we get something that's contradictory or kind of different than what was true in 2014, then we want to dive deeper and we want to better understand kind of what might be going on. And so I think, for example, just on the canvassing aspect, I think our results were more around kind of what's going on with turnout and door to door, whereas, there's other evidence that points to, real value in terms of, for example, deep canvassing and moving attitudes around issues around LGBTQ rights and things like that. And so there's details that for example, like persuasion versus mobilization, like we don't want to get lost on that either, because those are very different conversations. And there's also a wide variety of quality across something like that, as opposed to like a mail program. And so we want to better understand those pieces of quality and kind of what it really means to have a conversation with a voter, and that making sure we're not just yelling information at them.
Yeah, I think that dovetails into the ability to like just count and show like a high number of door knocks. But Zoe, I think you were about to dive in.
Yeah, so Lala Zhu, she was the deputy campaign coordinating director for Arizona, I think in the 22 cycle. And now she's doing some law fellowship in DC, but has an incredible quote from from the Pete presidential primary, which was, for her, she was the data director in Iowa then. It's better to imperfectly measure tactics we know work than perfectly measure those that don't. And part of this is like, we should try to measure things. The more we learn, the better. It's okay if we're not perfectly measuring it, like direction, like someone said this earlier about digital, like about message testing on online, but directional is helpful. Like we should learn more as a community on what things move the needle, which way. And I think to David's point, like there's so much nuance here. Like we're trying to get people to change their mind, sometimes about beliefs they hold very deeply, or take an action in like the world that's very busy. Like that's like really, really hard to do. So the more that we as a community can knowledge share and try to measure the things we are doing, the better we will be, because we don't have as much money as the other side who can do like crazy R&D. So we gotta like do this communally.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I think this is maybe more in like the organization C4 space, C4, C3 space, or PAC space, maybe, where you maybe have to interact with funders more, who, have heard sort of a stray thought of like, okay, this is what this study said. We don't want to do any more of that anymore, and so we have to sort of have these very difficult, nuanced conversations about like, okay, well, here's how this all comes together. So it's a tricky thing to sort of try to balance of like, how do we both advocate for our programs and then also give ourselves that space to imperfectly measure something and, again, try to move things along. And so we only have a few more minutes, but there's a slim margin in the House. We're, depending on the day where we are, we're just a few seats away from retaking the majority. Where do you all see the sort of map and how that plays out in this next cycle?
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think if history has shown us anything, it's that midterms are unkind to the incumbent party in the White House. I think at House Majority PAC, we are mindful of the fact that like the world is different right now. So what happened in 2018 or what happened in 2014 or 10 might not necessarily apply. But I do think that it's not like these guys took office and started doing things that were popular. And so much of this is still conceptual, but when they actually pass some of these bills and turn them into laws, and the country and the electorate really starts to feel the consequences of just a reckless economic agenda, um, I do think that there will be backlash, and that is something that we need to be ready to leverage in addition to outlining, an alternative. And so while yes, there's not as much obvious territory, Republicans representing districts that Harris won, I still think that just a small shift in the overall um, environment has the potential to have massive impact on how the House plays out next year. And I'm pretty optimistic about that.
I would just add, historically, only I think twice since World War II has the incumbent president not lost seats in the House at the first midterm. And so like history's on our favor. But I'd rather not rely on that. And so, I'm concerned and kind of want us all to be able to take a fresh look at our tactics, to be supporting our burned out organizers in a more sustainable way, and supporting organizing to make our politics less transactional, because I think people know that, people feel that. And so kind of I'd say that's what I hope for. I kind of leave it open if I am hopeful, but I would love to be surprised.
Yeah, I think that's a good like sort of reminder and warning that like, yeah, the history is there and we could do well, but if we don't sort of fix some of these things, take a good closer look at, sort of re-examining our playbooks, like we could end up in a bad place. So like we got to do the work, and also it benefits, our teams of people who are doing this hard work and are looking for hope and looking for outlets. And uh Dahlia or Zoe, anything else giving you hope? We can close it out on
Oh,
that.
yeah, massively. So there's about 3,200-ish counties in the United States. Over 1,200 counties applied to be part of the grants program, which was that like the energy is there. These are not paid staff. These are not campaign professionals. These are like our neighbors, people like showing up to their county Dems to do this work. And we're seeing shifts that like are in places where we're organizing. So like in some of our contest every race counties, for example, even in places where in like we lost Georgia, in our grants counties, we saw Harris outperform Biden. So not everywhere, but in a notable amount of them in terms of vote share movement. And the momentum is, I don't know if all of us feel it. I mean, this for me, like 2018, I remember feeling it. It was like this like crazy rush of energy, but like the No Kings protest, like people are fired up. I don't know where these people were before, and it's kind of like, guys, you're like really late to the party, but like we're happy that they're at the party. And I think that we got to figure out how to keep them here, and we will know what's working if we measure it. And yeah, thanks for having me. This has been very fun to chat about. Let's go take the house.
Dahlia, do you want to jump in?
I just wanna agree with Zoe because it's true. There's so many people who wanna get involved now. We've been having like over 30,000 people join our trainings across the nation, even the world. So we have people in Italy, Canada, France, Mexico too. And it's just really cool to see how they want to get involved and mobilize. So I just really hope that momentum continues to next year, and they build long-lasting groups that could be mobilized next year during the election.
That's fantastic. Any other parting words, David or Shripal, before we close it out? We are over. But this has been an amazing conversation. So thank you all. All right. Well, give it up for the panelists in the chat. We're gonna close it out. Here, I believe Deborah's dropped in a link for the feedback survey. So we'd love to hear from you all. And next week we have coaching week. We are going to have folks on staff available to help support you in your career. If you're thinking about congressional races, if you're thinking about other types of races, how you can sort of get some hands-on guidance, and as you're sort of navigating where you are in your career. And then just a reminder, July 8th, we have a organizing where you live workshop. This is going to be interactive. We'll walk through sort of foundational in-person tactics to connect you with others and get you active locally. And so we'll drop the Mobilize chat in the link for you all. I think that is all. I think that is our time. Reminder, if you're taking part in the book club, Let This Radicalize You and Tyranny of the Minority are the books that we're reading. And so I'll leave it at that. Thank you all for joining us. Big shout out and thank you to all of our amazing panelists. You all, thanks for hanging in with us on this very hot summer day. But appreciate you all. Take it easy.